Hello, I'm Mal McKissick. I'm co-director of the Bereavement Care Centre in Sydney. During the past 20 years, I've counselled many hundreds of bereaved people and run training programs for health and welfare workers through the centre, as well as nationally and internationally. The Bereavement Care Centre was established in 1986 in order to provide skilled, sensitive counselling for newly bereaved people. All proceeds of our training material, including this video, go towards helping us maintain this very special service. Over the years in counselling and in training, I found there are fundamental points that are essential knowledge for any bereavement support person in order to help them facilitate healthy accommodation of grief in a newly bereaved person. I believe that you'll find that Bereavement 101 is the essence. It's the building block. In fact, it's a foundation of all bereavement counselling skills taught through the Bereavement Care Centre. Okay, so these are the factors influencing bereavement outcome. If you understand this, then all the rest that you do will be on a good foundation. So the first one we need to consider is, first, we survive. By the way, excuse my scribble. As I get into this, you'll find that I scribble a fair bit more. So if you have trouble reading, just let me know. I'm going to be talking about everything I'm writing, so hopefully either audibly or visually you'll pick it up. But in terms of survival, that's what a lot of other people refer to as denial. I prefer not to use the word denial because it's, even though it's an ego defence mechanism, people see it as a punitive thing, like they use it accusatory when they say, do you deny that you were there on the 15th of September? As if the person who is bereaved is willfully misleading people. Survival to me infers a transient phenomena, that it's in transition, that it's changing. And it's like if we imagine your house is burning down, the big fireball comes over from the bush in the backyard and it hits your house and it's starting to burn. You don't stand inside the house thinking, dear, I'm going to miss this place. You don't stand in there grieving, you actually just split. You get the hell out of there if you've got your brains. So first you survive, but then what seems to happen is we survive and then we grieve. So imagine the same house that's burning down, that's now gutted, days, weeks, whenever it's safe to come back towards your house, you imagine it from up the street. You get this vista of what was your home is now a charred mess. And so you sense, no, it can't be, it can't be, it can't be. Well, clearly it is, it is, it is. Yet you sense the protest. So there's this sort of juxtaposition. That's what we call the dissociative process. On one hand, you can perceive it to be true. On the other hand, you want to reject its truth. But again, continuing the story of the analogy, you're coming down to your house, you walk in the front gate, maybe en route to the house even, you stop and pause for a minute and lots of feelings come up, and what nobody else knows is there's a little gardenia bush that you planted 3 years ago when your mum died, and now it's ruined. So even some old grief of mum comes to the surface en route to your gutted house. Okay, so all this stuff is coming up, no one else understands. And you walk in, actually walking where your door used to be. It's funny, we don't actually walk in where the walls used to be, even though they're not there anymore. We still habitually go in the same pattern. So we're walking where the door used to be. And you can watch these people now as they're coming back to their burnt house, they're actually looking around at nothing, because that's where the walls used to be. And they're actually looking at the photograph of their baby or their mum that used to be on the wall that now isn't there anymore. But they appear to be staring into space as if they've lost it completely. And they usually carry a shoebox, and they're going around sifting through the rubble, picking up things to put in the shoebox that to the observer appear to be just molten mass. There's nothing there anymore, nothing discernible, but to them they appear to be treasures. So they're sifting through the rubble, finding meaning and treasures. That analogy is a good one to hold in your mind as you think about bereavement. It's not so much the event, it's the ramifications of the event. It's what it means to that person. So they find meaning in the rubble. And you can imagine sifting through the rubble for days or weeks or months, or symbolically, even years later, when you're looking for some treasure, your child's christening cup, and you think, oh no, not that too, and that may be years later. But you can't grieve, as it were, for the christening cup until you recognise that it's missing. Right? So that's a transitory process. First we survive, then we grieve. It's meant to somehow balance the linear model that people think about. Well, they relate the grief to the event. The event was that long ago, and now you should be this far along in your grief. And yet, grief is a recurring phenomenon. We find that a lot of people are trying to placate the bereaved person. They're trying to stop them from showing too many feelings. And although it's well meant, what they're actually trying to do is get people to get on with, to let go of. So they describe people in a derogatory way. They say, they broke down, fell apart, went to pieces, cracked up. Now, even those words are inferring that this person is dysfunctional and their behaviour is dysfunctional. Because when if you've got a car that breaks down or falls apart or goes to pieces, well, it's dysfunctional for any purpose. Whereas the bereaved person may well be rendered dysfunctional in their grief for the previously assigned task. They're now functional for the new task, which is called mourning. It's actually a functional process. So even I think when we're describing bereaved people, we need to change our vocabulary and see what they're doing is functional. When we're actually talking, when I say we, I don't mean you, I mean the people who aren't here. Maybe they're talking because they're saying to the bereaved person things like, buck up, think of the kids, pull yourself together, every cloud's got a silver lining, it's God's will, it's fate, it only takes time. You're young enough, you can get married again and have another baby anyway, you had good innings. Right? So all of those things are actually designed to get people to get on with, to move away from, to let go of. And even though they're well meant, I know they're done with the best of intentions, letting go isn't what this person is going to do. It's accommodating. It's actually finding another place for that person and that memory. And this transition is an important process. That's what we call grief. So first we survive and then we grieve. Point number 2 is looking at the biochemical reactions of grief. So there are 3 parts to this. First of all, there's a feeling. As a result of a feeling, there's a behaviour. And as a result of a behaviour, there's a biochemical reaction. Let me put that into words that you'll be familiar with. Let's say the feeling is one of sadness. So some people feel sad. When some people feel sad, they cry. Now, not everyone cries. This is just an example. When you cry, you secrete a chemical called metaenkephalin. As I said, my scribble gets less and less legible. So this sad cry metaenkephalin. Now, what's the important thing here is that metaenkephalin is a narcotic-like substance that we secrete when we're crying. William Freyerdahl at Minnesota University did about 7 years researching tears. I mean, tears researchers do some boring things. So anyway, 7 years they spent looking at tears, and they looked at tears of happiness, tears of sadness, tears of onion peeling, and they found that only tears of distress had this chemical in them. And it seems that, for instance, the tear of onion peeling is a solution that flushes the toxin from the onion from your eye, whereas a tear of distress provides a chemical that your body needs in grief. And this metaenkephalin, remember, don't worry about the name, but it's a narcotic-like substance. It's like a sort of morphine. So it means that when you're crying at tears of distress, this narcotic goes to your eye, sits in your tear duct, your eyelid, is absorbed through the viscera, distributed through your vascular system. So as you're crying tears of distress, you're getting a hit of a narcotic-like substance. That's fantastic. If you listen to people, bereaved people tell you all the time, oh, I sat down, had a good cry, and I felt better afterwards. It seems a paradox that they use the word good to describe something that appears really painful. People don't say, oh, I had a rotten cry, I had a woeful howl, I had this terrible week. They actually say, I had a good cry. And the reason they feel better afterwards is they're stoned. They're wet. And it's narcotic. Yeah, it's fabulous. But what most people want you to do is stop the behaviour. People quite genuinely and with the best of intentions believe if they can stop your behaviour, they'll stop the feeling. Wrong. It just means the feeling doesn't have vent, and if the feeling doesn't have vent as behaviour, you don't get the balm, the healing agent. Now, I just want to say that, as I said, not everyone cries. Some people actually get angry. And what we find that someone who is expressing this behaviour as anger actually produces endorphins, other forms of chemicals. All I'm saying is that people need to display the behaviour because that gives them access to it. So that's, again, fundamental. But see this as a psychobiological phenomena, a feeling and a physical reaction, will understand why people need to do what they need to do. Third in this, these factors is the idea of regression. Now, regression, again, is an ego defense mechanism. It's something that's designed to protect us against the onslaught of material we perceive to be injurious or harmful. Basically, it's care-eliciting behaviour. It allows us to go back to a period in our life when receiving help was expected. But rather than look at the psychological jargon and definitions, what I prefer to do is suggest that each of us, as a bereaved adult, have a functional vulnerability similar to that of an 8 to 15-year-old. Now, I'm not meaning to sound patronising or saying that the bereaved person is childlike. I'm just saying they are that vulnerable. The newly bereaved person is that vulnerable that they don't have the resources, the cognitive frame of reference to make the choices they might otherwise make if they weren't bereaved. So when we're actually aware of this person's behaviour, we need to see that they are incredibly vulnerable. It's meant to send out messages, I need help, come in closer, be here for me. So we go back to, and you could probably anticipate yourself, if you remember what it was like being 8 to 15 in your pre-adolescence, adolescent state, it'll probably help you understand what you would be like when you're bereaved. So if you're a person who sort of withdrew and did a lot in your bedroom or ran outside and played or whatever, that's virtually what you're going to do, a big person version of that. The trouble is, and what's important to reinforce now, is imagine that in your 8 to 15-year-old status, you had another trauma in your life when you were a pre-adolescent or adolescent. Let's say there was child sexual abuse or something like that. Then you regress to an exaggerated vulnerability. So your behaviour might seem out of keeping with this bereavement. And that's what I'm going to go on and talk about now. We need to look at risk factors, those things which influence the bereavement outcome again. So let me just change this. So these are risk factors. A risk factor is an entity which has the capacity to complicate the grieving process. It doesn't mean it will. There are 12 of these, and it covers just about any other entity you could consider. And these aren't in a prioritised order, right? They're not saying the top is the hardest and the bottom is anything like that. So first of all, we'll look at sudden death. Sudden death because you don't have any anticipatory grief. When someone dies suddenly, there's no comprehension of the likelihood of that. Anticipatory grief has been somewhat misunderstood. In the past, people have suggested that it helps you accept the inevitable demise or death of a person, whereas I think it actually means that we gradually become accustomed to the withdrawal of that person, but moreover we reassign attributes and abilities. Let me put that in understandable language. Let's say that a superficial example that Dad, your age, Dad was dying, and he was normally the guy who mowed the lawn, but in the last 6 months of his life he's too incapacitated or ill to mow the lawn, so he needs somebody else to mow the lawn. So then when eventually 6 months later Dad dies, you don't sit and watch the grass growing thinking, boy, if he was here now that would be a lot shorter. Right? So you actually reassign that attribute or ability to somebody else or somewhere else. So gradually those things, not only the physical characteristics and tasks of Dad, but also some of the emotional attributes and abilities, we actually reassign. So when we actually get to the point of Dad actually dying, we miss the unique, but not so many of the attributes and abilities because we reassign them. Whereas in sudden death, you not only miss the unique, you miss all the things that person was, that you're totally unprepared for. Next is the death of a child. What's important as you're remembering these things is that there is a sliding scale. Sudden death ostensibly means that without any anticipation. But you could be working with someone or supporting a person whose husband is dying, and it sounds like to them it was sudden. They say, oh look, we knew Mum was dying, we just didn't expect it so soon. Okay, that for them is sudden. So there's a sort of sliding scale. Same about a child. Ostensibly I'm talking about a minor here, but realistically everyone who dies is somebody's child. And it's important at some level to bear that in mind, that the 70-year-old could be the 90-year-old's son. And to the 90-year-old, that's their baby. And I think that subtlety allows us to move inside the space of the heart of the bereaved person and fully comprehend, like maybe nobody else will. But back to the child, say the minor, we don't anticipate our children, our young people predeceasing us. So again, we don't prepare for it. There are very few role models in society. And as people like Terry Randall, Beverly Fail say, that the death of the child interferes with your assumptive world, meaning that which was least expected, that is your child to die, occurs, then everything else you took for granted now is fragile. That, you know, you think, well, the roof never falls in. Well, children never die, so maybe it will fall in. The car that's coming down the road might hit me. So you seem to have a lot more anxiety that your world is more fragile. Your boundaries are no longer clear. Your emotional boundaries, your physical boundaries. So it often interferes with your whole life and pervades every moment. But not only every moment now, every moment often for a long time in your bereavement and frequently throughout your life, because your children are still always meant to be there. Traumatic witness. Traumatic witness, what that means is not just the way in which someone dies, it means that they died traumatically, but it means the bereaved actually witnessed them dying that way, or in some way encountered their body without preparation. If your dad commits suicide by hanging himself in the garage, you will be bereaved. If you walk into the garage and find him hanging, you'll be bereaved and traumatized. It is traumatic witness. So there's a sensory stimulation attached to the traumatic death. That is, you saw, you smelt, you felt, you heard, those sort of things. So it seems to penetrate your core through all of your senses. What we know then, if you work with someone who has been traumatized in such a way, seeing their child hit by the car in front of them, that we need to do some de-traumatizing by letting them talk and talk and talk about that event, so they externalize the event, whilst we also plan to do longer-term follow-up for their bereavement. So they've got a duality, hence the risk factor. Lack of reality. Reality for a bereaved person is two things. It's being able to spend intimate time with the person who has died and being able to actively participate in a rite of passage like a funeral. So they're incredibly important. There are specific ways we need to do that. So I'm going to come back to that a bit later. But we know that the people, for instance, when the body hasn't been found, MIAs, missing in action, yachting things, when the yacht goes down and someone goes down with it, we know that those people have enormous difficulty adjusting to the reality of death. We know from clinical experience that when people come in for counselling and they actually haven't spent intimate time with the person, and they may not have actively participated in the funeral, or they're even tranquilised during the funeral process, then we know that they're having a great deal of difficulty adjusting to that reality. Well, how can you adjust to reality when there isn't any? So I'm not saying everyone has to, we just know that most people will benefit from it, and that's why I want to come back to it later. Centrality. Centrality, the degree to which the bereaved perceive the deceased, the dead person, as being central to their life. I use the word perceive because no one else might agree with it. I remember being in Memphis during the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and seeing some of the Afro-American youth who were lamenting, I believe grieving, over this person they never even knew. That he was dead before they were born, and yet, as I perceived their behaviour, I would say, yep, they're grieving. They perceived him as an icon of being central to their cause and their movement, and they miss not being able to associate with and gain from and being inspired by that. So that's that sort of perceived centrality. You'll actually hear people describe how important this person was in their life. That's one of the things that bereaved people do all the time. So you're gauging that, and the greater the perceived centrality, the greater the intensity of bereavement, as a rule of thumb. Okay, there are exceptions to that rule. So if you're supporting someone who was very close to this individual and they had an intense centrality, and you don't see much reaction, that's when you're thinking, something's going on here I don't understand. Or vice versa, intense reaction, but you can't find a relationship here. Like, look, something else is going on. I'll give you an example of how it might happen in around a same death. If we had a woman who's full-term pregnant and has a stillbirth. Now we know the biological centrality is much greater between the mother and the baby than it is between the father and the baby. Mother couldn't do anything without considering the baby, particularly near the end of the pregnancy, whereas dad can do just about everything without considering the baby. So when the baby dies, the mother's centrality is far greater than the father's, so her reaction may be more intense than the father's. They're both grieving to 100% of their capacity and centrality, they're just different and one might be more intense than the other. Not because dad's a male and a mongrel, just because the centrality wasn't as tight. Preventability. The degree to which the bereaved believed the death was preventable, ostensibly by them. Again, it's a perception, not necessarily an accurate phenomenon. So when we're talking about preventability, it might include the dad who reverses his car out of the garage, feels a pine cone under the wheel and powers backwards, then looks in front and his infant is dead. Right? So that's highly preventable. And everyone might agree with that preventability. But it might also be the woman whose husband dies as a result of his bowel cancer, and now this woman hears from the State Cancer Council advertisements, high fibre, low fat, no bowel cancer. She feels, I fed him the food that killed him. It's all my fault. Now that's her perceived reality. So for her, she believes it was preventable by her. It's not a time to discount what she's saying, it's a time to hear that she's saying there's nothing I wouldn't have done if I could have kept him alive, even changed what I cooked every day. It's a reality for her. It might also be the parent of the child who dies from skin cancer who says, if only I'd slip, slap, slopped, he wouldn't have died. Let's go here. Ambivalence. Ambivalence in a relationship is hard to deal with anyway, in a living relationship. You love, you hate, you sort of get into one feeling and you get into another feeling. Then in death it's equally hard. As you begin to get into the experience of I miss him, I wish he'd have been here, then you get into the mongrel, if only you hadn't, we would have enjoyed it more. So even as a supporter, you're trying to support one aspect of what they're saying, then they might switch to the other one. And we know already that behaviour is important as a stimulant for the biochemistry, and this person doesn't follow through on either behaviour. It's incredibly difficult at that time. Decreased social support. We know that bereaved people experience a whole lot of people moving away from them, but people cross this road to avoid bereaved people. I think that we have a trouble with passion. We don't really know how to support people who are passionate. We have trouble with a lot of people who are partying even. If they're full of joy, we feel they're coming on a bit strong. So it's the same in bereavement. People literally do cross the street to avoid bereaved people. So very soon, their support system seems to decrease significantly. So it's important that when you're doing an assessment, when you're supporting someone, you find out who else is there and how quickly they're dropping off. Aligned with that is decreased role diversity. Decreased role diversity. A role is something into which you put significant energy and from which you gain significant return. Work, family, school, home, religion, sport, whatever it might be. If we go back to the pregnant mum a little while ago, let's say she's full-term pregnant, she's on maternity leave, can't play squash anymore for obvious reasons, can't play bridge because she can't get near the table. About all she can do is get into a beanbag. She can't get out, but she can get in. Whereas dad still has to go to work, not because he's a mongrel, someone's got to earn the money, may still be in the social club and plays cards, whatever he does. So his roles are still fairly similar, whereas mum was putting her energy into being mum. That was her role, that was a big deal. Now that stops. Doesn't feel like a mum anymore, yet she's geared up for it and nothing else. So that decreased role diversity may impact greater on her than on the dad. It may. Pre-existing factors. Pre-existing factors. Okay, if you're an alcoholic or a heavy drinker and someone close to you dies, you go and get drunk. You don't sober up, work through your grief in a healthy way, and then go and get drunk. You just keep doing what you're doing. Because the reality is, bereaved people become an exaggerated version of what they were before. They don't actually change their personalities. So that which pre-existed, marital disharmony, drug and alcohol intake, unresolved grief, whatever it might be, it will persist through bereavement as well. So we need to know what went before. Concurrent crisis. Concurrent crisis, there are very few bereavements that don't have with them a concurrent crisis. Let's say that the wage earner dies, loss of income, can't afford the rent, got to move house, kids have got to move school. So in almost the average scenario, there are significant concurrent crises, any one of which would be a dramatic experience for the bereaved. But when they're all together, it seems we have this incredible ability to survive a crisis. When I work with bereaved people, I am humbled and encouraged by what they survive. It seems we have this extraordinary ability to survive a crisis. It's concurrent crisis we have more difficulty with. So when you're supporting a person, you're also looking for what else is going on in their life to know and understand how come this is so hard for them. Okay, finally, and I know there's a lot to remember. Finally, we're looking at overly prolonged dying. I told you my scribble would become illegible. Overly prolonged dying, we're looking actually about technology, whether it's a person who is expected to die from cancer, who has treatment, goes into remission, goes into relapse, remission, relapse, so they sort of get sick, get better, get sick, get better. So we, instead of gearing up for them dying, we actually gear up for them getting better. And then they die, we seem to be totally unprepared. But not only that, we used up all our resources, people aren't coming anymore, so we're not getting the support we were. In fact, everyone's geared up for them living, and then they die, we're behind the eight ball. So part of it's because of modern technology. To the other extreme, it's a sudden death situation where you've got someone who comes into accident emergency, intensive care, is put on so-called life supports, and their life or their animation is suspended. And then if they're brain dead, we've actually got this incredible difficulty of people comprehending the normal stimulus of death. So the person who's on life supports, even if they're brain dead, appears as if they're alive, but asleep. Their heart is still beating, their chest is still breathing, and it's really hard to adjust to the other indicators of death when they're absent. And so that overly prolonged dying process seems to interfere. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use any technology, we just need to know that it's a risk factor for this person and will influence their outcome. Okay, so they're the risk factors that we need to understand. Just in completing, what's then, when you're thinking about normal bereavement, which is an incredibly hard thing to define, I want to show you the equation, the mathematical equation. So I'll just write it down as I talk about it. First of all, you need to know the person. Because bereavement doesn't exist in the absence of a person. So you've got to know the person. Who is this person? And when you understand normal person, you'll understand normal grief for them. Then you need to know the event. What happened? Because in that way you can assess the risk factors. Was it traumatic? Was it sudden? Then you need to know the impact. What happened to this person when this event occurred? That includes how did they find out? Who told them? Because we know if grandma runs in the middle of the night, wakes up the kids and says, wake up, there's been an accident, mummy and daddy are dead. As the informant, grandma is often pushed aside because we behead the messenger, figuratively speaking. So then we need to know the affect. For me that means what came out when this message went in. Did they scream? Did they yell? Did they go to scream and they were tranquilized? Someone gave them injection, don't upset yourself, or we calmed them down. So if the impact isn't equal to the affect, then maybe there's something trapped on the inside. Then we have to know meaning. Remember back to sifting through the rubble. Meaning. People are going to give meaning to this event. So in this sense you get to know the person who's bereaved, in this sense you get to know the person who died. And if you do both of those, you'll be effective in your bereavement support. It's then When you know that, then you understand the individual grief reaction. Only then can you give some understanding to other people about what grief is. So what we're looking at, first of all, we need to know that people survive and then they grieve. That there is a biological reaction. There are a whole lot of chemicals that happen to people that they need to through their behaviour. We need to know there are a lot of risk factors for people, and that takes into account all the other things. If you know those 12 risk factors, then you can assess any bereavement situation as a bereavement support person. Then when you're trying to define individual grief reaction, if you look at this equation, then you won't be judging this person by somebody else's standards. These are the things that are really important to understand. So, the needs of the bereaved. Okay, whilst most things about bereavement are unpredictable, there are certain things we can anticipate. And from the thousands of people we've seen at the Bereavement Care Centre, there are 5 that most have shared in common. So that's what I want to talk about now. So it's not inclusive of all the needs. I'm talking about 5 of the most important needs and those which are shared in common. And of those, probably the most important is reality. People need access to reality. Now, reality for a bereaved person are 2 things. One is having access to the body, and the other is a meaningful rite of passage. The funeral, in other words. So, one of the hardest things, I think, is probably to encourage someone to view the body. Yet I think that's what we have to do. So the way in which we do that is important. We need to explain to the bereaved what they're about to experience. In order to do that, as a supporter, you need to have been able to spend time with the person who has died first. You know, when I'm actually encouraging someone to view a body, I would always go and spend time with the deceased first. For a start, I'm a sensitive person and I reserve the right to my own reaction without having to simultaneously care for somebody else, and so do you. But you also need to know how to prepare the bereaved for what they're about to experience. So you need to know how that person looks, any conditions, where they are, that sort of stuff. So then you can actually explain to the bereaved person what to anticipate before you go in. And that way we avoid any extra trauma through that unnecessary and sudden confrontation. So if we just explain the condition of the person, what they're about to see. When I'm encouraging someone, I no longer say, would you like to or do you want to? Because those words have positive connotations. I actually say something like, I believe it'll be beneficial in the long term if you're able to spend some time with your mum before we go. So to encourage them in that way. Then the rite of passage, the funeral, I think is meant to say something about the person who has died, something about the bereaved. So it has a notion of past, present and future. So that if I'm conducting a funeral, that the people who attend actually know that I'm talking about the person they know. And if they didn't know them, but they're there to support the bereaved, I help them get to know them through the funeral process. So if I'm talking about, let's say, even a stillborn baby that the majority of people who attend the funeral wouldn't have known, then through the parents I get to know the baby, and I introduce that baby symbolically through my words to this group of people. So as I get to know the baby and the pregnancy, as I talk to mum and dad, I will have a sense of who the baby is, and I'll help the mourners get to know them. And I might find that mum, you know, during her pregnancy, not only did they prepare the nursery, they went into the purchase of equipment and mobiles and little plastic things that you hang on the end of the cot and you pull it and it plays Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I tell all those stories to the people who are gathered. Then when we're talking about the baby, and say that mum used to go into the nursery and take the baby because the baby's on the inside, and whenever she went in there she used to pull this thing and it played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and mum would hold her tummy and the baby near this thing, then people begin to engage and they understand about the grief. So then in the ceremony, in the rite of passage, one of us, all of us, mum, dad, myself or me on their behalf, might say, and the parents want me to play some music for you. And I don't play Mozart's Requiem. I get this little pink plastic thing and I pull the string and it plays Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. and then everyone is engaged. Everyone will have some feelings, not because of the music, because the music is symbolic of the relationship the parents have with the baby. If that is not this as meaningful, that's why people haven't engaged successfully in the funeral. That's why it ceased to be meaningful, because people don't introduce or reintroduce or make central that is ceased with the process. In order to do that, what we need to display is empathy. A few hackneyed words. Empathy means that ability to go inside somebody else's experience and be there for them. Now, one of the things, if you're sensitive, you're going to experience when you're working with someone who's bereaved is helplessness. You'll feel helpless. In fact, that's probably the most common reaction in supporters, or in fact anyone who's around a bereaved person is feeling helpless. What I want to reassure you is that helplessness is a form of empathy. If you're a really sensitive human being, you're going to feel very helpless. So learning the skills and the knowledge about supporting bereaved people doesn't mean overcoming helplessness. It means being able to live with the helplessness, being able to become familiar with the helplessness and be there for them anyway. Because you're going to feel helpless if you're empathic, sensitive. You're going to feel a range of other things, sad, angry, a whole range of things. So it's important, even though we're told often not to get too involved, being with a bereaved person and being successful in bereavement support means getting involved. Next, we need to give people permission. Permission to be themselves, permission to grieve in their own way. For instance, permission to cry, which sounds crazy, fancy having to give people permission to cry, but we do, because everyone else is, remember, telling them to buck up, think of the kids, pull yourself together, and we're saying, no, it's okay to cry. But also, permission not to cry. Sometimes I have people who are referred to me because they're not showing their feelings. They come along saying, well, you know, I'm here because I haven't been able to cry since my son died, and it's been 18 months. And I say, oh, I see you're the sort of person who cried fairly easily before your son died, are you? Oh, no, not in my family, they say. I haven't cried for 40 years. I was like, well, why should you start now? Well, everyone keeps telling me if I don't, I'm going to explode. All these feelings. Well, I understand what they're trying to say. They're trying to be helpful. Maybe they're trying to be sensitive, compassionate, understanding. They're wrong, that's all. So, in fact, if we go back to remembering, if you understand the person, then you'll know how they grieve. Individuality. I said these were hackneyed. Individuality means everyone we work with is an individual, is unique. So they will grieve in a unique way. We don't have to worry about gender, age, religion, because if those things are important, the person we're talking to will tell us they're important. So you don't have to worry about what the Buddhists do or Greeks do or Armenians, you know. If what they do is important, then the person you're talking to will tell you how important it is. You don't have to know about Judaism, because a Jewish person will tell you about that if it's important to them. Everyone is an individual. Reminds me of that line I love out of Life of Brian, you know, when Brian is being busted by his mother being in bed with a woman of all things, and his mother sort of says, you know, he's not a Messiah, he's just a naughty boy. Yeah, that sort of stuff. And so Brian goes over to the window, and there's all these thousands of people out there with their sandals saying, you know, we want Brian. And Brian says, go away, you're all individuals. And they said, yes, in unison, we're all individuals. And there's one guy sitting on a step over in the corner and says, I'm not. That's the guy we're working with, the one who's not an individual. And if you just see that even in families, in a constellation, be they family, community, then each individual is likely to grieve differently, as indeed they have lived differently. Now, one of the most important, as I rub these out to come back to, because it's very misunderstood, is the notion of time. So the fifth point is about time. When we're talking about needs. Of course people need time. But it seems to me when people say to an individual, well, it takes time, that's almost a cliche or a platitude. In time you'll be better, which often infers, so you may as well feel better now about feeling better in the future. And it's still an attempt to placate. And we're saying, no, if you really understand the time that people need, you'll be there with them rather than telling them. So let's look at day one. When someone's bereaved, day one, there's not a great deal, it doesn't matter what sort of a good support person you are or even a counsellor, that being with the bereaved person means that you're going to feel those feelings of helplessness. There's not much... I mean, the bereaved person, day one, is having trouble breathing, let alone talking or needing counselling. You maybe open the window and help them get more air. We can help them view the body, we can do those things, we can talk to them about their rights and responsibilities, we can help them make phone calls, create comfort. But really, remember, we're working with the 8 to 15-year-old. Slow down, take your time. There are 2 rules in bereavement. The first one is slow down, and the second one, there are no other rules. So that means day one, slow down, be aware that you're working with the 8 to 15. Not on the 8 to 15-year-old. 8 to 15-year-old. We're actually working with a shocked 8 to 15-year-old. This person is experiencing psychogenic shock. So they're a shocked 8 to 15-year-old. And don't forget, they're also stoned. So it's actually a shocked, stoned 8 to 15-year-old. Well, just about anything you do isn't going to be very effective. We can be there as their advocate to provide safety rather than input. Unfortunately, this is a time when often we have to ask about things like organ donor, and we're asking this 8 to 15-year-old who is shocked and stoned, will you donate your relative's organs? I also know there's no other time we can ask that question. It just means that we are asking a question of someone who may not have the capacity to answer, and we need to listen to what they're saying and indeed support them thereafter. The next significant time in this linear model, as reluctant as I am to talk about a linear model, that is this sort of theoretically sequential process, the next significant time in our society seems to be around day 3. Day 3, when we sort of want to have the funeral and we want that to be over and done with. Yet I would suggest that the notion of day 3 or 3 days comes from cultures where they do a lot of weeping and wailing between day 1 and day 3. And we know when you've been weeping and wailing for 3 days and 3 nights, you haven't got a wail left in your body. You're all wailed out. Then it appears it's time to get on with the body disposal, as it were. But what we do in our society is we stick to the disposal time without doing the weeping and wailing. And that's working against us. If I had much influence, it would be to suggest that in our society, maybe having the funeral around day 7 is a far better idea, when we're more likely to have done more of the weeping and wailing. The people I work with who say have a funeral organised for day 3 and then for whatever reason have to postpone it till day 7, they actually organise a very different funeral by day 7 than the one they originally had. It's often more personalised, they're more actively involved, it for them is more meaningful. One of the unfortunate things about all this, of course, is between day 2 and day 5, we have this influx of people who come in. So you're trying to adjust to the absence of one human being, and you've got an influx of 300. It's called convergence phenomena. In our society, we only get together at weddings and funerals, so you've got all these people coming into town, and they haven't seen you for a long time, so they bring the snaps of New Zealand, and they bring the stories of their last holidays, and meet the new baby, and all that sort of stuff. So we're catching up on all the news while we're trying to adjust to a death. It's an incongruence. Not only do they come into town, remember, helpless, they're also feeling helpless. So they do everything for the bereaved person who gets to do less than they've ever done in their life at a time when they've got more adrenaline in their body than they've ever had in their life. So you've got more energy to do things and you get to do less. If you watch bereaved people, it looks like they've got agitated depression because they're sitting in a chair and they go to get up and they sit up and they get down and they get down. The reason they do this a lot is because every time they go to get up, someone says, no, sit down, we'll fix it. No, stay there, we'll fix it. No, don't worry, we'll look after it. They're trying to get out of their chair to do something, and all these 300 people do things for them. So they come in and they cook and they clean and they wash and they mow. They mow the lawn several times a day. It's a brown patch out the back where the grass used to be. They not only clean the house, they'll paint it. They'll get any tins and they paint the house and they wash the dog. They say, I've washed your dog, I don't have a dog. Well, we've washed somebody's. So they get all this energy and they use it up because they're feeling so helpless. You can see where they've been. You've got a sort of rainbow-coloured house, brown patch in the back where the grass used to be. All the dogs in the street are clean, and you're going up and down like this. So you can see where they've been. Then they try to force feed you, because they've cooked all these soup and scones, and they say, now come on, you've got to eat something. Now what we know about bereavement and biochemistry is you don't got to eat anything. Is that this narcotic, remember the narcotic, methamphetamine, creates anorexia. It says don't eat. Because what happens is that this narcotic slows down the peristalsis in your bowel, which really gets rid of the stuff out of your bowel. It's not working anymore. So your brain says, don't eat because it can't go anywhere. Oh no, now come on, you've got to eat something. Okay. Bereaved people spend most of their time making other people feel comfortable, so they eat.
The bereaved person eats, now you've got heartburn, dyspepsia, indigestion, constipation, they feel terrific. All right? So even though they're trying to help, they're trying to do the best thing by you, what they're doing is working against your own biological needs. The only reason you've got to eat something, if you don't, the cook feels terrible. And then they say, now come on, you've got to have a good night's sleep. Good night's sleep. You've got all this adrenaline, heartburn, dyspepsia, constipation. You're ready for the minute mile and they want you to have a good night's sleep. The only reason you've got to have a good night's sleep, if you don't, someone's going to sit up with you. So they give you the Mogadon, the Euhypnos, whatever it is, they knock you out, you go to bed, you're like a cockroach, legs up in the air. You're feeling the stress of grief, you wake up, you're feeling the biochemical responses to the hypnotic. You wake up in the morning feeling dreadful, and they feel much better. The only reason you've got to have a good night's sleep, because if you don't, someone's going to sit up with you. And they're stuffed, they're buggered, they've been cooking, cleaning, washing, painting, mowing, did all the dog work. They're buggered, they just want to go to bed, so they knock you out so they can go to bed. The reality is, if we listen to people, they will do what they need to do. Then by day 5, everyone splits, they're gone, because they only get 3 days compassionate leave. So they've got to go back to work, back to wherever the hell they came from. But you've got a rainbow house, a vat of soup, a garbage bag full of scones, heartburn, dyspepsia, indigestion. Then by day 7, you're all alone. And what we know around day 7 is that people start to have these experiences which are often inexplicable. They hear the person, they see the person, they smell the person, all those sort of things, and now there's no one to talk to. Then we move on. The next significant time seems to be 4 to 6 weeks later. Now people left at day 5. 4 to 6 weeks later you're alone, and what we find is that people start saying it's getting worse. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And what I think is happening is that this narcotic-like stuff is wearing off over this period of time. So whilst we can't predict, we can anticipate that around 4 to 6 weeks later people are going to tell us it's feeling worse rather than better. The trouble is, if we're not careful, this person is referred off to someone who will medicate them for being normal. So you go off to the doctor, you're crying a lot, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, it's called anorexia, insomnia and depression, and doctor says, look, I'll just give you this little bottle of Serenity and Peace and I want you to live happily ever after. That's Serepax, Serenity and Peace in a bottle. And we know that causes iatrogenic depression. Those tablets are likely to make you feel worse in the long term. There's nothing wrong with intermittent use, short-term use, but over a longer period of time they make it worse. Now this goes on up and down, up and down, up and up, now to 11 to 13 months later. Remember, everyone split at day 5, and here you are going through this year of up and down experiences till you get up to the anniversary, and the anniversary reaction we know is likely to be similar to the first month here. Yet everyone is gone, and they start labelling the bereavement up here. They don't anticipate, they don't expect, and they certainly don't allow. What we can do is anticipate that whilst this is unpredictable, that these experiences that happen in this first year are likely to be similar points of pain. When this wave-like motion occurs, people are likely to feel pain that is similar throughout here, but at unpredictable periods. Sometimes it's around an anniversary when it's a birthday or Christmas, but other times it's for no reason at all. It just comes from nowhere. What we anticipate is that the length of time you spend in the pain actually gets shorter, and the length of time between periods of pain get longer. But it will occur generally throughout the first year or two in unpredictable ways. Now, if you want to really understand bereavement, you only have to look at this board, and it's a mess. That's what bereavement's like. If you're looking for a theory on which to base bereavement, it's not the psychological theories that we know, but it's actually a theory of chaos. Now, the theory of chaos comes from physics. Meteorologists use it all the time to explain why they can't predict the weather. They're saying there are so many significant variables that we just don't know what is going to happen to whom and where. And they suggest via the butterfly theory that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, it changes the weather wherever we are. We just don't know when they're going to flap, how many are going to flap, what direction they're facing when they flap. So this chaos theory gives us an understanding of the unpredictable nature of bereavement, that it will certainly go on for a long period of time, much longer than this 3 days compassionate leave we give people. So the chaos that people experience is often exaggerated and dramatic. If we can spend time in chaos without acting upon our desire to control it, will be more beneficial to the bereaved person. So if we look back at the experience of this person, we know that they need access to reality, that if we can be empathic means getting in amongst the chaos. So the best support workers are going to be those who can live in the midst of chaos without acting upon the desire to change it. So whilst things are unpredictable, if we can see that they're anticipatable and we understand it's going to be a chaotic reaction, then we'll be much more able to support the bereaved person in the way that they need us to. Okay, understanding the reactions of the bereaved. Now there are lots of reactions, so I'm only going to talk about some of them. And for every emotional trauma in life, there's a physical reaction, very much like for every physical trauma, there's an emotional reaction. So I'm going to talk about both of those, but generally I'm going to talk about the ones that people find most difficult, either supporters or family or friends have difficulty in understanding these reactions. So they're the ones I want to talk about, but of course there are a whole myriad of other responses that bereaved people have. So what I want to start with is talking about the physical. So let's put that under bodily distress. Now, bodily distress for me comes in 3 degrees. And you can't go away and look this up in your psychological funkenwagonals. It's just me putting a concept into numbers when I look at 3 degrees. So 1st degree, 2nd degree, and 3rd degree. 1st degree bodily distress is where, as we talked about before, you have the loss of appetite, the constipation, headaches, so a whole range of things that go on. In fact, it affects virtually every part of your body. So if you look at your respiratory system, you're going to find yourself sighing more than usual. If you go through, look at your cardiovascular system, maybe what's called postural hypertension, when you're sort of sitting down, you stand up and you go all dizzy. Right through your digestive system, your genitourinary system, so you find yourself maybe having stress incontinence, in women amenorrhea, dysmenorrhea, period problems, in other words, painful periods, absence, it's just tough. And that's 1st degree. So they're the sort of common things that happen physically to bereaved people. Now 2nd degree is interesting because for me 2nd degree is where we actually produce a symptom that in some way reflects the nature of the death. Now, the one you'd be familiar with is let's say a husband dies of a heart attack, wife goes off to the doctor with acute chest pain. So she actually has a symptom. Now a symptom meaning that it's experienced by the patient as it were, but it's not measurable or observable. So wife goes off to the doctor with acute chest pain, he does an ECG, no abnormality detected. So in fact there's no heart disease, there's heart discomfort or heartache, so that's the pain that's there, but it's actually not disease. But it might be if someone dies from a subarachnoid hemorrhage or a motor vehicle accident when they have head injuries, then maybe this person has a headache, migraine, blurred vision, those sort of things. Again, you do a medical workup, no known cause, there's nothing there. But no one else can observe or measure it. So that's where we have 2nd degree bodily distress. 3rd degree is somewhat more fascinating when we look at people actually having a sign. Now a sign means it's observable and or measurable by an outsider. So this bereaved person has a sign that reflects the nature of the death. One lady I worked with, for example, who had 2 cot deaths, following her 2nd cot death, she produced a phantom pregnancy, which included a full-term abdominal size, enlarged breasts, normal uterus, no baby. So somehow her body had responded in this very graphic, measurable, observable sense, but she wasn't pregnant. A couple of other examples. A guy I worked with whose son was incinerated in a car that blew up at a service station, and that father would come out in this spontaneous welts of blisters over his body. Dermatological workup, no known cause. So my differential diagnosis, if you like, is 3rd degree bodily distress. This means this is made in the absence of any other medical finding. Of course, when you've got these welts coming out on your body, you've got to have a medical workup and find out is there anything wrong. But then as a counsellor, I see this as being a differential diagnosis in the absence of any other finding. You find a person I work with whose child died of a cancer that involved the bladder, and he had hematuria, that means blood in the urine. 6 weeks after he died, then his mother and brother had hematuria of unknown etiology, meaning they both had blood in the urine, medical workup, no one could find a cause for it. yet it reflected what had happened to their son and brother. So I have no explanation for that. All I'm doing is describing, not prescribing. And so we see that fairly commonly. It just shows, A, how intense grief can be and how it can affect all of your body, but also it shows us a little bit of how naive we are medically, that we actually don't know and understand a lot of this. So as you as a support worker, all I'm saying, it's important not to freak out if this is happening to someone. By all means get a physical workup, but understand that that will subside eventually with good care. Okay, now let's look at some of the emotional responses. Some of the biggest people have trouble with: anger, guilt. Let's stick with those. I think anger and guilt on the inside are fairly similar in their, at least in their musculoskeletal sense, that you're sort of screwed up, that you're tight. When we're actually describing anger and guilt, we're describing how someone behaves when they have that feeling. So if you say, well, look at him, he's feeling angry, well, the only way we know he's feeling angry because he's showing us with that behaviour. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, I can handle his grief, it's his anger I can't handle. I say, that is his grief. You know, a lot of people think that only grief and sadness are synonymous. No, grief and almost any reaction are synonymous. So when we know this person, if we go back to getting to know the person, then we know there's someone who is capable of expressing themselves as anger. They often do respond to situations in anger. Well, you can probably anticipate that that person will respond angrily in their bereavement. What's important is to see that how we respond to anger is incredibly important. So we have to look at our family of origin. What happened in our family when someone became angry? How did we deal with it? What happened? So if anger led to violation or aggression in our family of origin, then we're likely to respond defensively when someone gets angry. Let's say that dad beat mum up in your childhood. Whatever you did then, you're now going to do a big person version of. And we need to get some insight. Be aware that now is not the time to act out that defence, but maybe to let someone be angry. But I need to differentiate between anger and aggression a little bit, because I'm not saying anyone has the right to violate. Bereaved people don't become aggressive. Aggressive people become bereaved. So if someone's being aggressive and violating you, well then you don't tolerate it. A bereavement supporter, even family, friend or counsellor, doesn't have to put up with a violation. But if we understand the difference between anger and aggression, maybe we can be present to the anger a little bit more without thinking it will lead to aggression. If we look at, let me differentiate for a moment. If I'm expressing anger, I might yell and raise my voice and I say, yeah, it's all right for you, I bet it's never happened to you. No, don't tell me about it. I mean, and what we do is then we walk away. Yeah, well, blah, blah. And so we actually raise our voice, we direct attention at this person, but we generally increase the gap between us and them. That's what anger does. We sort of walk away. We make eye contact with that person and want to slam it home, but we don't actually encroach on their personal space. Whereas the aggressive person does. They go towards. They say, yeah, it's all right for you, I bet it's never happened to you. No. So they not only yell and raise their voice, they actually close the distance. So if there is a minimal gauge of the difference between anger and aggression, it's probably the distance, whether it's lengthened or closed. But don't worry about your psychological assessment skills. When someone's being aggressive, trust the hairs on the back of your neck. If they stand up, get the hell out of there, you know. Don't worry about trying to assess and help, just split, because no one has the right to violate you. But in 20 or so years of working with bereaved persons, I've never found that aggressive outburst. Lots of anger, lots of passion, but not the violence or the violation. As men, we're taught to be angry, so it's more likely, but certainly not exclusively, that men are more likely than women to express their grief as anger. You know, we're taught to blame everybody. You're not going to watch, question times on Parliament. Watch politicians all the time. They're blaming each other. It's his fault, it's their fault. No one says, oh yeah, I think it was my fault, I'm sorry. I don't think so. We're taught to actually project and blame other people. And it works. It's called displacement. You know that in your, the husband who has an angry outburst at work and walks away, doesn't tell his boss because he can't tell his boss he'll get a bad shift or whatever it is. So he gets in his car on the way home and says, where'd you get your licence, you mongrel, Woolworths? And actually takes it out and the driver doesn't got a clue what this guy's yelling about. Or takes it home to the family and says, not beans again. And so the wife says, you can't talk to him and he's like that. And she goes out in the kitchen to fix something else and the young bloke walks past, across the lounge room, carpet, soccer boots on. Get out of here with those boots on, how many times I've got to tell you? And the young bloke says, oh, you can't talk to mum when she's like that. And the old man's in there off his face. Goes out in the backyard and the Dog walks past, dog, soccer boots, dog, woof, drop kicks the dog down the backyard. So each one is actually displacing, they're passing their anger on, and as men we're more likely to do that. Eventually it comes back because the dog sits there thinking, tomorrow the postman cometh. And so eventually the dog bites the postman sues the father, and before very long he's got the anger back again. But for a while there was relief. And that's what we learn as men, we learn to put it out. As I said, not exclusively, but more likely. On the other hand, it's more likely that women will express this as guilt. Women are taught, in the main, to be responsible for things, just about everything. Unemployment, nuclear war, child raising, whatever it is. Again, not exclusively, but if you think about it, we actually say, well, if only women went back to the home and looked after kids like they're supposed to, there'd be no unemployment problem, you see. So it's not the treasurer's fault, it's women's fault. Unfortunately, that's numerically true. But it's equally true to say, well, on the other hand, if men went and looked after kids, there'd be no unemployment problem either. But no one ever says that. They just say, if only women did. Or if you walk out in the street, you see a kid sitting in the gutter with a dirty nappy and snotty nose and no adult. Someone says, where's his mother? They don't say, where's his father? So we actually blame the mother for not being there. And whilst we do that, although I'm being flippant in some way, that seems to carry through in a cultural sense. So it shouldn't be surprising that when a child dies or a death occurs, that maybe women are more likely to express it as guilt. The trouble is you can't walk away from guilt like you can from anger. You can't put it out there because it's in here. So the guilty person is more likely to sort of stand looking down and say, it's all my fault, it's all my fault. For some reason when we're guilty we cease to make eye contact. I mean, you ask your kids, did you touch those biscuits? No, Mum. All right, so they actually look down, and bereaved people are the same. So they're looking down saying, it's all my fault, it's all my fault. The hardest thing to do now is to live with your own helplessness and not act upon your desire to control that person's expression. Because a bereaved person who's feeling guilty isn't sitting there thinking, oh, how can I upset these people? I know, I'll tell them I'm guilty. No, they just be. They just be what they are and do what they need to do. If you don't rush in and stop them, it might appear to intensify for a little while when they're saying, it's all my fault, I should have been there, I should have been there. Okay, if you really understand what they're doing, you know they need to get it out. It's coming out. When they've done enough, they come back and make eye contact. Look, I'm sorry, Mel, I don't mean to keep doing this. So they come up, they make eye contact, they're inhibiting themselves. We don't have to. They just need to get a little bit out. Maybe we're the only ones who'll actually hear what they're saying. And what they're saying is, Mal, there's nothing I wouldn't have done to keep him alive if I could have. That's what they're actually saying. But they're actually adding, can you hear what I'm saying? So a response, be that verbal or not, needs to say, yep, I can hear you. Not extend it to, but I wish you wouldn't. Just, yep, I can hear you. The trouble is, what we do a lot of the time is we actually physically interfere, not only verbally. When the listener, the supporter is there, they reach out and touch them on the knee and say, now come on, don't blame yourself, it's not your fault. And I'm saying, as far as possible, leave knees alone. It amuses me that we rub someone's knee when they're sitting there. It's not their knee that's hurting, it's their heart. Why the hell are we rubbing their knee? Their knee's fine. What we need to do is touch their heart, and that's a symbolic phenomena. And you can touch someone's heart by allowing them to be themselves in a safe place. And that's when they'll actually say, I was really touched a while ago, Mel. And they mean metaphorically touched in their heart. The other thing, instead of rubbing knees these days, what we find is a lot of people actually, because under EEO policy you're not allowed to touch people's bodies, so we actually touch the chair they're sitting in. So you come down beside this person and you say, now come on, you can't blame yourself. So we take on what I call the I care pose, which is something like this. Now come on, you can't blame yourself. Now this is a bizarre pose, and you wouldn't do it unless you really cared. I mean, you're sitting here with your knees bent, your arm out. This proves you care. Then we actually say to the bereaved person not to do it. Now come on, you can't blame yourself, it's not your fault. He wouldn't want you to be saying that. Oh yeah, that'll work, bring in the dead, that'll work. So we know they feel good at that they're good at being guilty. So if we make them be guilty for feeling guilty, then maybe they'll stop. This is a convoluted thing we're doing. Now come on, don't blame yourself. He wouldn't want you to be saying that. So we take on the I care pose, which proves we care, otherwise we wouldn't do this. The trouble is you're stuck, because if you move you don't care anymore, and you do, so you've got to stay here. In the first instance your intention is to be them-centred. I care. Oh, that's fine for about 15 seconds. After which your body says, what the hell are you still doing like this? So you actually, your quadriceps fill up with tension if you don't move. Then you get this little tremor down your legs like this. But you still care, so you've got to stay there. Now, you can't possibly be them-centred because you're you-centred, so this tremor gets bigger. It says move, and now you're really uncomfortable, so it goes up your back, down your arms. Before very long, your client's in an ejector chair, right? And what happens is empathy is a two-way street. They pick up how uncomfortable you are, so they reassure you. Thanks, Mel, I'm okay now, right? Whilst that may not have been the design, that's the effect. So before very long, we actually pick up this person is reassuring us, but what we did to stop them from feeling guilty appears to be work. Go back to what I said earlier. We've actually stopped the behaviour, not the feeling. The feeling is still there. There's a bed-sitting version, of course, when you're visiting someone in hospital, when you sort of put a quarter of a cheek on the bed and you reach out to someone, you know. The standing version is, you know, we clutch people to our bosom. We say, come on, let it out. And they think, let what out? I can't breathe. And it goes all gluggy around your face. What we really needed to do was nothing. I know my wife gave me a compliment. She said, I do nothing very well. I'm choosing to believe that was a compliment. What we need to do is live with that helplessness in that moment, and when they're ready to invite us back in, they will. I understand how hard it is not to offer the reassurance. But unless we really have delusions of grandeur and believe we've got the powers of absolution, we really need to listen and trust that this person is doing what they need to do. The other thing that, in terms of reactions, that you hear a lot about is the notion of replacement. And this has often been overstated when people look at this as being building a mausoleum when the parents keep the room the way it was when the child died. And in fact, they're sort of linking objects, or maybe even like we refer to for babies as transitional objects. What they are real, often tangible, sensory stimulants that connect us to the deceased. I think they're positive things, yet everyone is telling you, you must let go. And so they mean that literally and symbolically. So letting go not only means letting go figuratively of the person who died, but you must give up all their possessions. Often to the point that people judge or diagnose you according to what you keep. So if what you keep still works, has monetary value, then you're all right. But if what you keep doesn't work anymore, or it has no inherent monetary value, then they say you're not all right. So you keep Grandpa's gold watch, that's fine. You keep his gardening jumper that's full of holes, that's not so fine. And I'm saying, what the hell? You talk to this person who keeps the jumper, they say, you know, Mal, when I hold Pop's jumper, I can still smell him, and I feel so close to him. Now, I don't know whether the smell's there or not, but they're using that as a transitional object. And I say, and when you smell it, what happens? Oh, I just remember the time we used to go down the garden. You know, my grandma was trying to get rid of his jumper for 10 years. And, but I'm glad I've got it. And when I think about it, I think about all the time we spent up the backyard, under the garden, under the tree, sitting in the garden. Grandma thought he was gardening. He was just going up there, I think, maybe to get away from her. But he used to teach me about gardening. At least I thought that's what he was teaching me. I really think he was teaching me about life. And I just wish he was here, that I could tell him that now I understand. Then I can say, mate, if he was here and you could tell him, what is it you wish you could say? And that's when we continue the dialogue of grief. And the accommodation process of grief is based around the capacity to turn a feeling into a dialogue. And all those transitional objects give us dialogue. It's the same for the person who says, you know, 3 years after the death, I need to get rid of the clothing now because I haven't been able to. Goes in, the wife gets out the suits of her husband, starts going through the pockets, finds what? 2 half tickets, Phantom of the Opera. Remembers when they went to Phantom of the Opera that long ago. 3 hours later, finds herself sitting on the floor, cuddling this suit and crying, and thinks, no, not now, I can't do it now, I can't get rid of them now, puts it back in the wardrobe. Now, to the unskilled observer who looks through the keyhole, sees that and says, oh, unresolved grief. What unresolved? I call it love. She's being in touch with love. What's unresolved about that? Yet I know that some of our clinical colleagues might see that as unresolved grief because this woman is now crying as she holds a suit. But if that same woman was sitting in a clinician's office and the clinician got her to cry 3 years later, they would call it a catharsis. They would say, well, really did some heavy work today. But here's this woman doing it for herself and they criticise it. And I think if we give people their own way, they will heal in their own time. So instead of letting go per se, we're actually talking about accommodate, right? Accommodating the grief rather than letting go of it, building it into our hearts so it remains a part of us that no longer intrudes on our life, but it remains a part of us forever. So instead of letting go, we're talking about accommodating, and the transitional nature of replacement objects will enhance our ability to do that. So if we look at things in terms of bodily distress, emotional and psychological reactions, then we know that people don't let go. They need the opportunity to tell their story over and over and over again with all of those feelings. They will go through it time and time again. They need time to remember the person who's died. And they need someone like you who will understand and let them talk without criticism. So, with the insights and information which I've outlined in Bereavement 101, hopefully you will have gained some awareness into your own reactions to death and grief, as well as enhancing your understanding of the grieving process. I hope that these important insights will enhance your ability to support bereaved people in a sensitive and empathic manner, and I'd like to wish you well with what can be difficult but rewarding work.